Thanks, Marie. Kia ora tātou, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation to the Association for me to be here. The original invitation did go to the Secretary for the Environment, Dr. Paul Reynolds, who had another commitment. So I was fortunate enough to get today's job, and I think it is appropriate given the nature of and theme of the conference and my particular areas of interest with respect to the environmental management system in New Zealand. As you'll all be aware, the national-led government was returned at the weekend, and they have identified further reform of the Resource Management Act as an immediate priority. The Ministry has, as you would expect, prepared briefings for incoming ministers, including our thoughts on further RMA reform. I hate to disappoint you though, but unfortunately today is not the time and place for me to be outlining that policy advice, as we've yet to have a minister appointed. So instead I thought today I would outline for you how the Ministry is approaching its future thinking in respect of the environmental management system and the resource management subsystem that resides within. And in doing so, I wanted to make some observations about some of the contemporary issues that you're all grappling with, and pose some questions for you to ponder over the next couple of days. I can't stay, unfortunately, but my colleague Guy Beatson, who is the Deputy Secretary responsible for the resource management system proper, will be arriving tonight and here over the next couple of days, and we've got a good number of Ministry staff in attendance, and so we are particularly interested in hearing your views over the next couple of days. I want to make a disclaimer at the outset that I am not a lawyer and I'm not a planner either. My background is in policy and strategy development within central government, so my observations very much come from about 30,000 feet. And I'm in some pretty awesome company. There are many people in this room that know a heck of a lot more about the resource management system than I am. So having made that disclaimer, I do want to reinforce the fact that we are particularly interested in the views of this conference at this point in time, because the association and its members very much operate at ground zero. You all operate within the bowels of the RM system, and so what you experience and see firsthand is vitally important for us to understand what's going on. Some of you seek to ensure outcomes are fairly arbitrated through the system's processes. Others of you seek to maximise the interests of your clients through what are often competitive and adversarial processes, whereby private individuals are seeking to maximise the rents they can accrue from public resources. Over the next couple of days, I'd like to invite you to think about the system from outside of the legal construct, a notion that we sometimes think of as being trapped inside the legislation. If we are to ensure that the resource management system is truly fit for purpose, then we need to be preoccupied with real-world outcomes rather than simply the jurisprudence, as important as it is, as the primary outcome. So I challenge you to think about whether we can do better as a small country with our limited human and financial resources and many growing pressures. The Ministry is presently giving the resource management system much consideration. We're doing this because after 23 years, and some 20 amendment bills that you're all very familiar with, the Ministry is taking a step back and trying to assess the performance of the system as a whole. Successive legislative amendments and the introduction of additional statutes have targeted specific processes and tensions with varying effectiveness. The Ministry believes that the focus now needs to shift to assessing whether the resource management and planning system as a whole remains fit for purpose. We're doing this because we believe New Zealand needs to take a more strategic approach to the way we manage, use and develop our natural resources, and in the ways we provide for economic, social, cultural and environmental well-being. We believe that we need more stable and durable institutions for our sustainable development. Natural resource issues demand sustained approaches. Many of the impacts on our environment can leave long legacies, and the time to remedy impacts can be lengthy indeed. Most environmental pressures develop by 1,000 cuts over long periods, not from single impacts. Efficient network infrastructure and community development require planned approaches that maximise the prudent use of scarce resources. Non-strategic approaches that discount the future can lock out future opportunities and create cumulative effects that overshoot biophysical tipping points. Furthermore, New Zealand is richly endowed in natural resources, which underpins our standard of living today. And in a finite world where resources will only become increasingly valuable to both use and to protect, we can expect that there will be increasing community tensions as the stakes rise around both the use and the protection of natural resources. And if we don't get better at reconciling and managing many of those conflicts, we're in for an expensive and paralysing time ahead. New Zealand does need to make the very best of its resources, but it also needs to protect the underpinning biophysical processes on which we depend, and our brand and reputation as a producer of the world. And all of this demands greater community agreement of what we're trying to achieve in order to secure investment, the social licence to operate, and most fundamentally, a physically sustainable future. This is an awesome challenge, but quite literally the future of our little country depends upon it. The Ministry for the Environment sees this challenge as core to its business. Our mission statement, as many of you will know, is environmental stewardship for a prosperous New Zealand. And in 2012, the Ministry was reviewed under the performance improvement framework that all government departments are assessed by to determine how well positioned they are to deliver for New Zealand over the medium term. In 2012, MFE's review said that, quote, "In future, the Ministry's focus needs to be on delivering long-term strategic policy frameworks, thought leadership, and improving the depth and scope of MFE's policy advice to ensure it is able to not only respond to the current priorities, but to set the policy agenda for the future." For a small agency with a history of standing to the side and observing the resource management system as the dead hand of the state, as our CE likes to describe it, this is no mean feat. The Performance Improvement Framework reviewers went further, and they stated that in their view, New Zealand needs a long-term strategy and analytical framework for environmental management that is capable of generating a glide path that New Zealanders broadly sign up to and that can allow for varying priorities through time. So in response to this big challenge, the Ministry's made some fairly significant steps forward, one of which was changing our operating model. What we've done is we've moved away from functional silos to create end-to-end integrative teams that consider strategy, science, policy, implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation in a single unified manner that has ultimately an outcomes focus. In this way, we've moved the monitoring of the resource management system from an evaluation silo into our Resource Management Policy and Implementation Directorate. Concomitant with this, we're also moving from the light touch of the biennial survey that you'll be familiar with to the more comprehensive national monitoring system, which will be increasingly geared to measuring outcomes, not just the timeliness of outputs. Another step has been the development of the Environmental Reporting Framework expressed in the Environmental Reporting Bill that's currently before Parliament. This sets up for the first time regular and statutorily independent reporting by the Secretary for the Environment and the Government Statistician on the state and trends in our environment across the domains of land, water, air, sea and climate. This framework also requires reporting on the pressures on the environment and the impacts that changes in state have on society and on the environment. The regime gets oversight from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, who's got a commentary role to ensure the integrity of the reporting. The first report under this regime was released in May on air quality, and work is well underway on the first synthesis report for release before the middle of next year. My vision is for this not to be another doorstop publication as previous State of Environment reports have been, but rather a suite of digital tools that tell a meaningful story to a range of audiences from school children to researchers. It's my hope that we can deliver on the Parliamentary Commissioner's challenge that she laid out to your Salmon lecture in July, that the new reporting regime drives a focus on what really matters at the expense of what doesn't, and over time helps prioritise our national efforts in environmental management. To support the development of a more strategic approach, the Ministry has also seized the review's challenge of creating an analytical framework by developing the Natural Resources Framework with our sister agencies in the natural resources sector. My colleague Guy described this framework to this conference last year, so I won't repeat it, but in simple terms, the framework seeks to understand environmental issues through a system lens that considers the political, the cultural and economic subsystems within. The framework seeks to explain outcomes in terms of institutions and their incentives, and in turn the behaviours that they drive. This is important as it can be challenging to attribute real-world outcomes to the outputs of our planning, consenting and legal processes. But I think we must strive to do so, otherwise ultimately the RMA emperor will truly have no clothes. All of this is about taking a deeper look at what's going on in the environmental management system and not leaping to quick fix solutions to reactively address the latest pressure. So the Ministry of the Environment is now focused on bringing together a coherent view of the performance of New Zealand's environmental management institutions, the drivers on individual and collective behaviour, the economic, social, cultural and environmental outcomes all of this are delivering for the nation. These will be reported regularly and independently to our citizenry to support more informed choices and debates about how we approach resource management and environmental management. And it's through doing this that we believe we've got the best chance over time of generating that glide path for New Zealand that our PIF review has challenged us to achieve. But we can't do this alone. We require all parts of the system to be generating this greater settlement in what we as a nation are trying to achieve. Which brings me back to this conference and its theme. The challenge for all of us is to ensure that over time the resource management system maintains or arguably develops legitimacy and delivers the outcomes New Zealand needs to prosper in an age of scarcity and increasing resource demands. We need institutions that are valued by those who use it, and let's be frank, the RMA faces a deficit in this regard. There are those who will say that it will always be so because it's inherent with the difficult calls required by the Act. But this is true in many other areas of public administration, and through a focus on demonstrating outcomes and making the processes user-friendly, many such other areas in public administration enjoy much greater levels of public support. And we need to ask ourselves why that is, and I encourage you to think about that over the next couple of days. The Ministry believes that all New Zealanders want to live in high-quality, sustainable environments, and they support the needs for the controls on resource use. Discussions with our most intensive extractive industries time and again demonstrate to me that they too accept the need for limits. But what they want most is certainty and processes that quickly and efficiently deliver outcomes, whatever these may be. I think we should reflect on how much dissatisfaction with the RMA is driven by the processes and the performance of our institutions relative to the purpose and the drafting of the Act. New Zealand is a small country with a small economy but with big aspirations. We're very good at developing theory and high principle, and we're very good at building institutions, but we often stumble when it comes to resourcing implementation. Much has been said on this issue with respect to RMA implementation, with endless calls for more national direction and better resourcing. These things are important and are being increasingly provided for. But can we do better with our existing institutions and instruments? It's very hard to make the case for more when there are perceptions that we're not using what we already have to best effect. So perhaps we should consider whether the environmental, economic, social and cultural context we find ourselves in, are we investing our time, our attention, our community debates and our scarce resources in the areas we really should? In the Salmon lecture earlier this year I mentioned by Jan Wright, she argued that the RMA doesn't encourage prioritisation. She suggested the system struggles to separate the important from the unimportant, and that we are often concerning ourselves with the wrong things. Today I want to build on Jan's observations around our lack of attention to what really matters, and the criteria she suggested for determining what should concern us most, issues which are irreversible, cumulative, pervasive, accelerating, and reaching tipping points. If we look at Part 2, Section 5, Clause 2, the very heart of the purpose of the Act, and consider for a moment the imperative of sustaining the potential of natural and physical resources to meet the reasonably foreseeable needs of future generations, and safeguarding the life-supporting capacity of, and in this case I want to focus on soil. Every year, New Zealand loses around 400 million tonnes of soil from our lands into our lakes, rivers, estuaries and washed into the ocean, degrading coastal ecosystems and our fisheries. New Zealand's rate of soil erosion is in the order of 10 times the global average, and at the global level the rates are not sustainable. More than 1 million hectares of our pastoral lands are erosion prone, and if you contemplate for a moment what even 1% of that soil loss, 4 million tonnes a year, means in the context of global food production, it's hard not to see how shameful this will look when the global population tops 9 billion at the middle of the century. And at that point in time, much more of the world's soils will be compromised. If you travel to any of the sites of formerly great civilisations around the world, in North Africa, Southern Europe, Middle East, Asia, and even parts of the Americas, over and over again you will find rocks and barren, arid landscapes where once thriving agricultural communities flourished. All of these sites have the common characteristic of depleted and exhausted soils from unsustainable agricultural practices. So when it comes to meeting the reasonably foreseeable needs of future generations and safeguarding life-supporting capacity, nothing could be more fundamental than securing our soils. Soils that took millions of years to accrue and as the foundation of our current economy. It's arguably our most precious resource. Now, water gets a lot of attention as being our great tonga, but water is vastly more renewable than soils, and without the nutrients contained in soil, water grows nothing. I believe the RMA has done too little to compel resource managers to address this, one of the most significant environmental issues facing New Zealand. So on this most fundamental of measures, the resource management system has failed us and continues to do so. The only local authority that I believe is actually requiring treatment of erosion-prone agricultural land is the Gisborne District Council. And I remember going to the Gisborne District Council 7 years ago with the then Minister of Agriculture when he had to submit to the council planning process and threaten to withdraw the Crown's funding for tree planting, which had been in place for 20 years since Cyclone Bowler, to get them to take regulatory action. On this occasion, it wasn't the fine words of Part 2 of the RMA that compelled a reluctant council to finally deal with a problem. And in their case, they have some of the worst soil erosion in the world. It was actually the threat of lost funding from a minister that made the difference. Now, there's a range of erosion guidelines and some controls in commercial forestry and urban environments around New Zealand that I'm aware of. But the problem is that the outcomes still persist on a staggering scale. So no one can convince me that this crucial dimension of life-supporting capacity of our environment is secure. Arguments that all of our erosion problems are the product of our young geology and topography and our climate simply don't wash when there are so many relatively low-cost solutions available. In my own home region of Hawke's Bay, the dry, barren hills that are denuded of the great podocarp forests that once secured their soils are actually now designated under the district plan as outstanding natural landscapes. And this is where I come back to Jan Wright's observations about landscape protection and her contrasting wind turbines that have an entirely temporary effect on the landscape with minimal ecological impact compared to issues like pests in our forests and climate change. In the case of king salmon, fish farms that are movable and which are only a temporary impact on the seafloor and have only relatively minor ecological effects are denied in favour of outstanding natural landscape designations. I recently visited, a couple of weeks ago, one of the sites that was turned down, and what I saw was that immediately after the Supreme Court's decision, an adjacent landowner had brought in a digger, cleared a patch of bush, carved a large ledge into the hillside, this is right in front of one of the sites, and built a house. Now that impact is far more permanent than any fish farm would have. Furthermore, when you consider the productivity of fish farming in terms of resources per kilogram of protein, a few hectares of non-permanent fish farms in the Marlborough Sounds produce vastly more protein and export revenue than the hundreds of hectares of low productivity and erosion-prone pastoral lands that are throughout the Marlborough Sounds, and yet they are deemed acceptable, if not iconic. I'm not questioning the decision of the Board of Inquiry or the Supreme Court. They had to work with what was in front of them and within their legal construct. But it is worth considering whether this is the sensible use of our natural resources that the architects of the RMA imagined, or whether somehow the system has prioritised the wrong things. Do the incentives in our system make it easier to protect amenity values for minority interests than foster the sustainable management of our natural resources? And if so, does this ultimately undermine public confidence in our resource management institutions? I encourage you to debate this question over the coming days. Of course, such high-profile consenting decisions could be described as atypical, and by some as great victories for the environment and communities. The very high proportion of everyday resource consents obtaining approval, 99% in fact, gets a fair bit of discussion. Some of the commentary suggests that this is the system working very well, and in other cases it's argued to be a case of the RMA being overly permissive to development. To me, the figures present a prima facie case of over-regulation of things that don't need to be regulated and under-regulation of the things that really matter. To what extent do we systematically monitor consent or plan compliance to determine whether consents continue to be the best way to manage activities? Perhaps once again we should be looking harder at the whole toolkit and consider whether whole of system performance provides some answers rather than just looking at the individual instruments. Just last week I was visiting oil and gas drilling operations in Taranaki. And as many of you will know, Jan Wright produced a report recently on that sector expressing some concern about the lack of regulatory oversight by councils. What didn't get a lot of coverage in that is the fact that the Taranaki Regional Council's plan designates oil and gas drilling as being permitted. But it's only permitted subject to a number of conditions. And there are also stringent petroleum regulations in place that ensure drilling practices minimises the chance of environmental harm. What the TRC does do is they put significant resources into monitoring and compliance of the activity on the ground, which is arguably more important to outcomes than whether or not a consent was required at the start. For the industry, they don't face the uncertainty of a consent process each time they plan to drill, but they're also very clear about what they need to do to be compliant, and they know that the council will be watching. My point here is whether it be for a simple matter such as building a garage or drilling 5 kilometres into the Earth's mantle, these and other matters may be able to be dealt with more through plans rather than by consent. Which brings me to the planning system and the debates about passive and positive planning. There appears to be a good argument that for much of the last 23 years, the system's tendency has been to overly plan by consent, which I know has been an issue of great debate, which creates greater cost, time and uncertainty than need be the case. And I know this has been argued around, but I think it is worth considering whether this is actually the Act's fault or there's something more at play. If some councils in some circumstances can do things differently and achieve better outcomes at lower costs, then what's going on? Are these questions more of culture, leadership and orientation? Why do some councils see the RMA as just another set of tools that help them discharge their responsibilities under the Local Government Act, when other councils start with the RMA planning process as their primary frame of reference? This is where the wider system comes into play. The roles and responsibilities of decision makers in the system, including the role of central government in providing direction, are important. But what are the current incentives on these decision makers, including ministers, and what might be done to change these incentives if we're getting suboptimal outcomes? As the Ministry tries to understand these questions, we're interested in your reflections on the incentives you see on the various players in the systems. Do you think the incentives drive the system toward truly achieving the lofty objectives in Part 2 of the Act? And even if they do partially, how efficiently is this achieved? Could we achieve the same outcomes more simply and at lower costs? Capability and capacity in local government, both in terms of governance and management, is highly variable, as we all know. And the Ministry believes we need to be asking whether the resources are really there to do the jobs we expect of local authorities in respect of resource management. It was instructive earlier this year when LG&Z released a survey of priorities for local government mayors and chairs, which stated that 84% of mayors and chairs said economic growth and jobs were by far the most important concerns they had. And 46% were concerned with environmental impact and sustainability. Now, I totally get the first priority, particularly given the challenges for regional economies in a globally traded environment. But the fact that the majority of council mayors and chairs didn't identify the environment as one of their top 3 priorities is simply staggering when you consider that these people lead the primary delivery institutions of the environmental management system. The focus for cities and districts understandably tends to be on the matters that are most visible to communities and which drive economic activity: stadiums, convention centres, opera houses, international airports. But when it comes to erosion control, or stormwater or waste disposal, the priority can be hard for elected representatives to get enthused about. The sources of local government funding, including rates, warrant further consideration. Being a tax on assets and not income, and paid directly in large sums, is never likely to sit comfortably with communities. And for many services provided by TLAs, which are adjacent to properties, there's a logic in maintaining a relationship between the property and the funding of services. However, for regional councils and the natural resource management functions of unitaries, the relationship can at times be more tenuous. In many cases, regional resource management functions are heavily subsidised by council-controlled assets, but this ends up meaning that a relatively small increase in expenditure can result in a large increase in rates on a percentage basis. In my case, I pay $150 a year to my regional council for a 3-hectare block of land, and I'd happily pay twice as much as that to get more done. But my councillors are very concerned about every percentage increase as opposed to the nominal sum. When it comes to territorial rates, a different story. So I think it's worth pondering whether we risk constraining the resourcing of these functions to levels that prevent the objectives of the RMA and the environmental management system more broadly being achieved. Different funding models may be able to target resources more according to capability needs, particularly for those parts of the country where the natural resource management challenge is huge and the population base is small. You will have gathered from my comments, and much of what you will have seen coming out of the Ministry in recent times, that there's a resurgent interest in planning. Experiences in Canterbury, Christchurch City and Auckland have partly driven this, and arguably we're emerging out of a period when the value and importance of planning has been somewhat maligned, in part due to the tendencies in the Act and in part by the profession itself. The RMA was of course created at a time when neoclassical economic prescriptions to all areas of public policy reigned supreme. These prescriptions were often beautifully elegant, but overly simplistic in hindsight, and they relied on assumptions that haven't always been borne out. The belief was that markets would optimally drive resource use efficiency and that only effects, basically the non-price externalities, needed managing. Today it seems like the faith in the rationality of the market not to overly discount futures and to efficiently align interdependent development seems a little misplaced. It has possibly been much less pricing of externalities than the original architects had envisaged. The incentives facing decision makers at national and local levels to actually tackle cumulative effects in a timely fashion in the absence of prescriptive planning were probably not well understood either. The planning profession also needs to take its share of responsibility. The RMA did envisage a new level of community participation in resource management. And I'm told by some in the planning profession that a behind closed doors technocratic approach that relied on traditional consultative processes of propose and defend has been the norm for the profession as it struggled to reinvent itself. Greater levels of co-design, including with councillors and collaboration with the community, hasn't come easily. And I'm also told that many in the profession have struggled with considering planning and consenting proposals in their full economic, social and cultural context, treating each proposition before them rather mechanistically and in isolation from the wider context. It's this character of the system that frustrates communities, and it gives the system a bad reputation as being non-responsive, cumbersome and bureaucratic. The opportunity for the planning profession is epitomised by the recent approaches to freshwater planning in Canterbury, to take new approaches that are not rely overly on legislative reform, but are very much around the opportunities that exist within legislation to do things differently, culturally differently, behaviourally differently. They're huge opportunities for this profession. Admittedly, in Canterbury's case, the ECAN Act has probably helped. But I'd like to question whether we really face a binary choice between passive and positive planning. Both sit arbitrarily really at ends of a continuum. Are we in fact faced with choices about where on this continuum we want to operate depending on the issue, possibly subject to the sorts of criteria suggested by Jan Wright? It's probably overly crude to suggest that planning under the RMA was never intended to be prescriptive, proactive or positive, particularly where network infrastructure or significant cumulative effects are concerned. But in this respect, should we accept that a degree of positive planning was always inevitable and is desirable? Is this really a question that we should be asking, one of degree and orientation, as opposed to which approach is right or wrong? If we plan by consent, or we plan by what we restrict and control rather than what we provide for, do we ultimately not achieve the same ends, but just do it in a more ad hoc and reactive manner? Can efficient urban development with all the network and social dependencies that go with it ever be achieved through passive planning alone? Big box retail developments in Auckland, which are famous of course, are a good case in point of consents operating in isolation from the broader infrastructural planning. In a market economy, it seems sensible that positive planning be restrained to only being undertaken to the extent necessary to ensure the efficient functioning of the market, including in areas such as housing development and transportation, and also to manage those non-priced externalities that can only be accounted for through regulatory control. But some level of positive planning in some areas must surely have a place, and this is what a number of recent interventions have sought to achieve in response to community demands, housing interventions being a case in point. All of this suggests a more integrative approach to resource management than has been typical in the last 23 years. At central government level, we see greater alignment across government portfolios, policies and legislation as desirable. We also see the need for regions, districts and cities to be better aligned in their priorities and planning. New Zealand simply can't afford the transaction costs of anything but. Finally today, I'd like to comment on one other debate that's been running around within the system, but is even more closely related to the Resource Management Act. I'd like to ask whether we face a binary choice between bottom lines and broad judgment. As has often been discussed at this conference and recently in Bill Hamilton's article in the RMLA Journal, the architects of the RMA intended for Section 5.2 A, B and C to be biophysical bottom lines that, in the words of the Honourable Simon Upton, must not be compromised. If these bottom lines or thresholds are the underpinning of the remainder of the architecture of the Act, with which communities free to make choices over and above those bottom lines, then it can be argued with some cogency that the Act, at its most fundamental level, will struggle in the absence of bottom lines. It's hard to argue that there are not biophysical limits that need to be protected in order for life to continue over time. Not everything can be traded off all of the time. Without bottom lines, or boundaries as they're increasingly described, it's hard to see how we can actually have a framework that meaningfully defines and guides choices for communities. Internationally, the idea of planetary boundaries and tipping points has become the focus of earth sciences and increasingly accepted by governments, business, scientists and NGOs as a fact and a necessity. As Bill Hamilton pointed out in his article, back in 1995, Simon Upton again argued that unless there is a bottom line, sustainable management ceases to be a fixed point or preeminent principle and sinks back into becoming a mealy-mouthed manifesto, only Simon could have said it like that, whose meaning is whatever decision makers on the day want it to be. The Chief Justice in her salmon lecture last year similarly observed that, quote, effective judicial supervision occurs where there are minimum standards or an enacted hierarchy of values to be protected. So if bottom lines are so important for the sound functioning of the system, then we need to understand why they haven't been forthcoming and what barriers are preventing them, whether these be social, cultural, political, economic or legal. And so it is our experience with freshwater policy. The lack of bottom lines and national guidance over the last 2 decades has undoubtedly contributed to the relatively poor progress many regions have made in managing water. The Land and Water Forum was instrumental in driving the national policy dialogue to a point where it was agreed that we need limits. The NPS and National Objectives Framework on Freshwater has all the elements of a way forward. It articulates and requires the enforcement of biophysical bottom lines based on science that fulfills the Section 5 requirements. The framework also guides choices for communities above this level that enables broad judgment to be exercised over a range of societal values, including environmental ones, but only above the bottom line. The approach also encourages collaborative planning and processes at the community level so that outcomes are planned and provided for, and therefore consenting activity can be significantly more certain and predictable for resource users, decision makers, and the wider community. It seems in this case we'll end up with a mixture of bottom lines, broad judgment, and some passive as well as positive planning emerging. And I want to just note that while science can help us enormously with defining bottom lines, science cannot give us the right answer, and some degree of judgment will always be required. In the case of the National Objectives Framework, some 60 scientists were asked to apply their best science and judgment to the question of bottom lines, which involve great debate. And it is true that there are still dissenting voices in the community on those bottom lines. While I think we should generally be striving for better environmental performance, I'd also note that bottom lines cannot be equated with very high levels of ecological health. Otherwise, the rest of the architecture of the Act falls over. Much of our use of natural resources would end up ultra vires the Act, and frankly, the legitimacy of modification of the environment for human welfare becomes in doubt. At this point, we don't have an economy. The Ministry believes we need an environmental management and planning system that can proactively identify fragilities in the resilience of our ecological systems and set and enforce bottom lines accordingly. We need a system that highlights and prioritises the issues that matter and facilitates community dialogue on these, supported by a strong evidential base. We need a system that develops broad community agreement on where higher levels of environmental protection should be achieved over and above these bottom lines, and make clear to resource users where, when and how resource use and development can take place. This needs to be predictable, and the cost of getting to this clarity of objectives and outcomes as low cost as possible. It may take some more upfront investment, but by reducing uncertainty and conflict down the track, we should reduce costs in the long run. So where does this leave us? I've argued today that the RMA needs to be seen in the context of the wider system in which it operates, and that we should concern ourselves more with the outcomes and the mechanics of the legislation. I've agreed with Jan Wright that the system is not encouraged to focus on what matters, and too often has undermined public confidence in our institutions by over-regulating things that matter less and under-regulating things that matter most. To this end, I've also contended that, as many others have, including the architects of the legislation, that we've delivered pretty average environmental and economic outcomes. The Ministry believes that broad judgment or balancing is appropriate for the Act, but only above bottom lines that need to be set. The National Objectives Framework is the very embodiment of this. Furthermore, we believe that for the effects-based approach to truly work as intended, then bottom lines are vital, and changes in the practice and the resourcing of planning is required. We believe that a more integrative approach is also required, and this isn't necessarily at odds with an effects-based approach. It is not binary. We can take an effects-based approach to planning and consenting while getting better at defining and articulating community outcomes through more engaged and collaborative planning practices based on better data and information to support both bottom lines and appropriate choices. We need to drive better alignment of national policy across areas of transport, housing and energy with local government, and we need to drive better alignment and coherency between regional, district and city planning. We believe that we can retain the best aspects of local decision-making where these are supported by national direction that helps set bottom lines and guide the choices available to communities. It's not a question of going back to the Town and Country Planning Act. Instead, we have the opportunity to take the next big leap of written reform of the RMA by thinking about our learnings from the past couple of decades and taking a system-wide approach that considers greater national direction, more investment in science and economics, as well as enhanced and supported capacity and capability of local authorities. If we constrain our thinking to simply more amendments to the Act and leave all other settings constant, then we're doomed to keep repeating the failings of the past 23 years. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, James. It was great to get a really clear indication of the Ministry's strategic direction for the RMA and the wider natural resources sector, and obviously everyone agrees it's very complex and multifaceted. So I'll now hand over to my willing assistant, Martin Williams, who has arrived to chair the panel session for the rest of this afternoon. There'll be questions at the end, and James, will you be around till the very end as well? So if you do have questions for James, he will still be here at the end for the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here. And thank you, Marie, for that introduction. Thank you, James, for, I only witnessed the tail end of it, but a very thought-provoking address. To plagiarise, as with the conference theme, Lewis Carroll again, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Sometimes it seems the journey we have been on in the past 23 years has been a bit like that. Destination unknown. Certainly my journey here today was something of a metaphor for the act. I went south, I went north, I went west, I went left, I went right, I went east. I had an emergency evacuation in Christchurch. What you will shortly hear, though, is that the drafters of the RMA had a very clear sense of direction at the outset. Since then, however, we have been guests at something of a Mad Hatter's tea party. Now, Mr. Upton in 1993, 4 or 5, I'm not sure which it was, but I was there at the Stace Hammond Grace lecture in Hamilton, and I was very privileged to attend. He stated quite emphatically as to the word while in section 5 that I meant what I said, to which at least until very recently the courts have rejoined, but yes, did you say what you meant? Now at this conference, looking as it will at the resource management system, the one we will need for future generations, we start today with the prelude, and you've heard from the Deputy Secretary about the Ministry's direction in the medium to long term and some of the challenges that all sounded very simple. Perhaps not. But to back that up, we have assembled the Council of the Wise and the Prophetic to share their vision of, firstly, where we thought we were going, secondly, whether we got lost on the way, and thirdly, perhaps more importantly, where to next and for the future. Now, our first speaker on the panel is Lindsay Gao, who was Deputy Chief Executive of the Ministry until 2009 and oversaw major policy and legislative changes, including the Act itself. In recognition of his contribution to the profession, he was awarded the RMLA's Outstanding Person Award in 2010 and has since then been undertaking a range of consultation work in the strategic policy and organisation governance fields. He will address what the RMA was meant to achieve. If you'd all join me in welcoming our first speaker, Lindsay Gao.
Well, hello there. Thank you, Martin. It's nice to know that the drafters of the RMA were so clear about what was going to happen. It's just a pity it didn't. I'm going to tell you why not. Going back to the 1980s, you would have heard about that. It's a fellow called, it was a Labor government actually, which completely turned New Zealand on its head, politically, economically, socially and culturally. And the RMA was born out of that maelstrom of political, social and economic change, not to mention the word environment, which started to creep into the lexicon. In fact, it had been in the lexicon for some time prior to 1980s. It started in New Zealand way back in the 19th century. And I want to record the importance in the 1930s of the soil conservation movement, which I think was one of the first really important advents of environmental awareness, notwithstanding where it may or may not have got to. We certainly did some things then and learnt some things that shaped really this idea that you should manage things in a multidisciplinary, multi-environmental way. The Commission for the Environment in the 1980s was another important institution set up to do environmental impact assessments, and it did more than that. It advocated strongly with a gentleman called Robert Muldoon that you probably know well. I used to know him, kind of feared him really, as we all did. I've seen him try to verbally kill people, including Ken Piddington, who took him on in Cabinet one day, about the National Development Act, which is the next thing on my list there. That was the first attempt where the government of the day found that multiple statutes couldn't accelerate its wishes, Bill Birch's wishes, as you may recall, to build lots of things, energy projects up and down the country. And in order to accelerate those in the way they wanted to, what's new, I hear you say, the National Development Act was written. And it jumped over a number of constitutional hoops. Geoffrey Palmer regarded it as a constitutional pariah. Other people didn't see it quite like that. But either way, it stimulated a lot of thinking about, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should put stuff together better. Another thing that came about in the 80s was the product of the Maori Renaissance, which in my view was built really from the professional Maori getting into universities and professions and using those in order to raise Maori issues in a much more political and cross-cultural way. And so that flavour started to flow through New Zealand politics. We invented terms like biculturalism and so on that started to grow. And then when the Labor government got into power, it rearranged the institutions, produced the Department of Conservation. Suddenly we had 30% or more of New Zealand in protected estate. That's amazing, actually, although a lot of it, of course, wasn't developed and still isn't. But we were way ahead of the game internationally with that. Ministry for the Environment, which I joined, was part of the idea of actually having a policy ministry inside the government that did the sort of things that James has been talking about. And then, and we've still got it, the Parliamentary Commissioner sitting outside looking on the system and reporting on its performance. So about that time, people were beginning to feel that the institutional arrangements, particularly the legislation, wasn't doing what it's meant to. It needed to be connected better, it wasn't performing, and so we had a series of reviews that started with town and country planning, water and soil legislation. All that started to ferment in a world where, in my view, we had the most bizarre socio-economic experiment launched upon us called the New Right. So here we had a Labor government that had leaped over the Conservative National government, that introduced a guy called Roger Douglas, who unleashed a treasury that was just ripe to rearrange the property and institutional landscape. And that landscape had absolutely no place for planning. It was a dirty word. It's remained a dirty word depending who you talk to since. Of course, it depends on what it does to you as to how you see it. Perversely, perhaps, the Resource Management Act actually came out of the New Right, who wanted to privatise, and still do, common natural resources like water, like coastal marine systems and so on. But they couldn't because of the Maori views and the wider political views. And so they accepted reluctantly that there was a thing called market failure. And the market failure meant you had to do something to legislate, and it was that kind of avenue that allowed us to get in part and propose the Resource Management Act. But that wouldn't have gone anywhere without some quite important people whose names are up there. One called Geoffrey Palmer, whom you've heard from. He was a law reformer, and really all he wanted to do was reform law. He hadn't had a lot to do with environment except when he came across the National Development Act. When he got into power as Minister for the Environment in the second term of the Labor government, we popped a package on his table which proposed a fairly significant law reform. Never seen anybody get so excited. And when Geoffrey gets excited, it's really worth looking at. He leaps around. 2 hours later, we were told to go away and make it happen immediately, if not sooner. And so we did. We needed a lot of resources. We had quite an imaginative and very large package. And he was sufficiently motivated that he went and got the money. We spent some millions of dollars doing what became the Resource Management Law Reform. That probably would have fallen on stony ground, in my view, unless David Cagle had magically got to be Minister of Finance. And he was a much more moderate and informed person about planning law and resource law and things than Roger Douglas ever was. And so he let or pulled the Treasury hounds off us and let what became the Resource Management Act through into the system. Then, of course, as Labor seems to do every now and then, they completely fell apart, collapsed utterly, and were looking for a new leader. And so we inherited Simon Upton. And I got to quite like Simon, although he was a difficult man to deal with, as some of these people in this room know. He was passionate. He was incredibly rational in a Simon Uptonish sort of way. And he was there to destroy the Resource Management Act. It seems to be a thing you do. You come in and you have to abolish it because it's environmental and it shouldn't be around. What happened? We proposed that he should review it, and he did, and he appointed some quite smart people, on advice of course, in part, and he listened to them. He listened to them, which is the one thing, isn't it, James, that you really do want ministers to do, to listen to good advice. And so we got the Resource Management Act, and his fingerprints are still on it. Bottom lines, which James mentioned. The fact that you can propose plans, and a number of other things that I've put in my paper but can't immediately remember. Simon, I can certainly remember him. So those people, as always is the case, just happened to be around at the right time, and you're all sitting here in a thing called the Resource Management Law Association because of them in part, and their passion and their ability to push this stuff through against a lot of opposition within their caucuses and cabinets and so on. Finally, local government reform. Without that, I don't think we'd have got the institutions we need. James mentioned that New Zealand's very good at inventing institutions, and we are. We do it very quickly. However, it's a dangerous thing because you can end up with too many too fast, and big changes take a long time to bed in. I was very passionate and still am about the regional authorities, regional councils for the most part now. I think they're an absolutely essential means of dealing with this business of land and water and integrating stuff across the package. So what did we have in mind then as I look back on it? And these are only some of the things, and they are things that just occur to me 22 years later. The first one, which probably hasn't happened as much as it should, is integrated resource management. We're still struggling to do that. It's tying stuff together that people traditionally didn't do. Soil conservation and the water and soil legislation kind of did it, but not as much as it could. It's got biodiversity, it's got ecosystems, it's got nutrients, it's got all those things. And it's very hard to do because when you try and analyse and manage all that stuff, it kind of becomes monstrous. Did it happen? In part, yes. Better than what otherwise would have happened, I think. Another big issue was local decision making. That comes with a price. People can get it wrong, they can get passionate, they can get parochial. Did they? Yes. All of those things. On balance, I think that having more decisions locally helps. New Zealand's an incredibly diverse country. One size doesn't fit all. And to have people, provided they're kind of informed, making local decisions, I think, is a good one. Effects-based plans and rules. The idea there was to actually have plans that didn't just try and regulate everything. That was the point of this thing, that you planned to deal with the issues that needed regulating, not with things that just got caught up in the mix. I don't think that's worked as well as it could. I think some of the interpretations of it have been incredibly pedantic and narrow. And I think James's point about that we spend an awful lot of time on minute detail when the big issues go sailing past is an example of what this kind of ended up doing in many ways, but it's an awful lot better than not thinking. Maori values and interests, a mixed bag. Yes, a lot more has been introduced. People don't like it. There's a big backlash against it all the time. But I think on balance it's gone further than it ever would have otherwise, and it's got a long way to go, and it's going to do it. Trade competition. Simon Upton was very passionate about that. We should make sure this was not an act where people used it for trade purposes. Did that work? Yes, well, I saw some very, very environmentally friendly large corporates playing in the Resource Management Act. And there have been an enormous number of changes about that. That tells you something, doesn't it? Public participation. We were told that if we opened it up to anybody being able to participate, the floodgates would open, it would be all over, you know, the place would fall apart. Didn't happen. Of course, people don't like public participation unless you're the public and you're participating. It's a mixed bag, isn't it? And there's been an enormous amount of churn over that issue with people wanting to have provisions that exclude the locals getting involved. Of course, if you include the locals up front at the beginning, it makes a huge difference, and there are techniques and ways of doing that. One of the successful things, I think, was declarations and enforcement procedures. Thank you, Environment Court, who've done that particularly well. It also provides an independent and judicially referenced system for declaring what plans can mean and enforcing them. Good idea, I think. And finally, national policy statements and standards. Well, we're still doing them. A lot of people want them. I've always felt that you shouldn't do these things too quickly. Yes, we took too long, I think. But to impose one size on everybody has its costs, and you have to know pretty carefully what you're doing before you do it. Okay, so where have we got to? 22 years later, we've still got the same structure, although the book's much, much larger. You just about need a... Well, they're going to sell them shortly to gymnasiums, apparently, so people can lift them up and down. But the same structure's still there. The same framework, an enormous number of the provisions, and despite the fact that in the media you think that everybody hates this thing, it's still intact pretty much. It's been amended far too many times and they've played with the edges a lot, but hey, still the same thing. So is that good? I think it's an example of something that's at least got some durable elements. We shouldn't throw it all away. Did it succeed? Well, yes and no, of course. But if you'd had the 59 statutes or whatever it was, of which there were a handful or more really big ones, and you tried to manage a sustainable economy using all of those and all of their different procedures and practices in this day and age, I don't think it would have worked very well. And I think we'd have wanted to have invented a National Development Act again. So where do we go next? James actually said a whole lot of stuff that I was going to tell you about, and he's right. We actually need to take stock of where our environmental and development economies are at and where we should go as a country. The big problem is, though, unfortunately for James and for the rest of us, New Zealanders don't do that very well. In fact, we run from it. And I've been involved in the national development thing in the 1960s and 70s and the Planning Council and a variety of institutions, all who had really good people doing that sort of stuff. And guess what? We don't even listen. New Zealanders tend only to gather together in adversity. Sadly, environment can't wait that long. So what are we going to do? We can't actually do everything together. We can't reduce it to sort of a whole bunch of science, and we can't reduce it to sort of a few sound bites. It's complex stuff. And yet, if you look there at the big issues, we're facing some monstrous issues globally and domestically. Climate change, energy is a huge part of it. It drives our society. We've used more of it since 1950s than anyone's ever used on this planet. Transport's a huge part of that. Urban development's another subset of that. All of those are things that we really have to do differently and better. And we have to transition into a very different society and economy. We don't have to lose our wealth, but my goodness, we have to operate, particularly our energy systems, very differently. And we're dependent on these words: biodiversity, ecosystems, sustainability of soil and water systems. And what are we doing? We're just pouring stuff in the top end and watching it drain out the bottom. And we've been doing that now for the last 100 years. We've learned a lot about how to manage it rather better, and that's good. But we've got to change the game substantially. Again, James mentioned that, and good luck to you in pushing that idea around, because until and unless we do it, our wonderful primary economy is not going to deliver for that much longer, at least not in the way it could and should. So here I say, of course, what do we need? Well, we need a strategic approach. And why would I not say that? Again, though, we don't do that stuff very well. What we have to do is actually try and simulate bits of it, inside the government and outside of it. We have to come back from the legislation, whether it's the RMA or anything else, and say to ourselves, where are we going to go as best as we can and how are we going to get there? And to do that, we've got to have some wider horizons.